This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, welcoming you to our transcript series of Spring 2012 events. In our podcast today, we present a speaker's dinner given on March the 29th, 2012, by Madame Charlotte Descamps. Madame Descamps lives on the Passchendaele battlefield of 1917, and her lecture is titled Living on the Battlefield.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with saying that I'm really honored and very grateful to have been invited to talk to you. The friendship, the warm welcome I have been experiencing here in Canada is something which will always stay with me. It's about a year ago that I came to Toronto for the very first time, and I then already made the promise that I was going to be back. Well, here I am, exactly a year later. I guess I was predestined to come to Canada because when I was born, nicely behind the front line of the First World War, my home farm, believe it or not, appears on trench maps as Canada Farm. The very first country I've ever lectured about the Great War is in Canada. So there's the link. I'm currently living right on the battlefield. As most Belgians do as they get married, I moved about 20 kilometers. Belgians are renowned for the fact that they stick to the place where they were born, and I was no exception to that rule. So I'm currently living right spot on the battlefield, and that is in Passchendaele, partly Poelcapelle. Violet Farm is a farm which is situated bang on the Passchendaele battlefield. We are about 10 kilometers to the northeast of the city of Ypres. Don't misread that as leper if you ever come to Belgium, because the Dutch spelling is with a capital I. Let that be clear. We are 2 kilometers to the west of the village of Passchendaele. So this map is, the larger map is showing the top corner of our country, and then a zoom in on where we are exactly. Violet Farm, will that? And that doesn't decide. No, it doesn't work. So, next slide, please. Okay. So Violet Farm, as I said, is bang on the battlefield. This is a trench map dating of July 1917. And there you will see the red, my remote should still do that. The red border there, that is where the original farm used to be. Surrounded by a moat. Let it be clear that Violet Farm is not the original Dutch name, of course. That is Wallemolenhof. And I guess that's good enough reason to call it something else. Wallemolenhof, however, has a meaning. Wal means moat, molen means mill, hof means farm. In other words, the original name of the farm was referring to a moated farm, which indeed it was, close to a mill. Going just south of the farm, that is where there used to be a mill. Now, just here on the hamlet, there used to be a mill. The mill has been destroyed during the Great War and has never been rebuilt. For those having an interest in maps, I would say compare First World War maps with modern INGN maps, and immediately you will notice that farms have moved position. The simple reason for that is that everything has been destroyed. I hope that you realize that in the narrow strip of land, which the salient was, a strip of land of no wider than 10 kilometers, running from the Belgian coast down to the French borders, about 60 kilometers in length, well, that narrow strip was completely destroyed. By the end of the Battle of Passchendaele, there wasn't a house still standing, there wasn't a tree still standing. There was just nothing. Of course, there weren't any civilians anymore in the area by 1917. The civilians in this area abandoned the area in 1914, on October the 20th to be precise. And how come we know the date so precisely? Well, the day before, October 19th, that is when the German army reached the neighboring town of Roeselare, 10 kilometers to the east. At that stage, it were French soldiers defending the city of Roeselare, and of course they opened fire towards the German enemy approaching. The Germans assumed that Belgian civilians had got involved. Franc-tireurs they were called. And just to make sure that that wasn't going to happen again, they lined up a number of male inhabitants of the city of Roeselare and executed them. Many of the farmers' daughters were working as housemaids washing ladies, with the wealthy families in town, and coming home in the evening, talking of stories which they had witnessed, talking of stories which they had heard of, the local population became scared. And sure enough, they were scared the following day, as the rumour was spreading around that the Germans were moving forward. So on October 20th, 1914, that is when the local population started to run. They loaded whatever was valuable to them on trailers, and off they went to France. Let it be clear that France isn't all that far away. 20 kilometers to the south and you're in France. People believed they were going to be safe there. Let it also be clear that at that early stage of the war, everyone, whether you were a German soldier, whether you were a Belgian refugee, or an Allied soldier, well, everyone was still convinced it was all going to be over by Christmas. They only forgot to mention which year. The blue square, closer to the road there, this here, that is the present position of Varlet Farm. So farms have basically all been rebuilt, in most cases closer to the road, to make them easier accessible. If you look to the north, where are we? So further north there, there. That is a German trench cutting across our fields. Just south of the trench you see the little crosses bored by a fence, and just north of the trench you see a little symbol which symbolizes a heavy battery position. In other words, there were field guns lined up on that particular field. And still today we can find the proof of that, because that's the only field on which we find unused German ammunition. An awful lot of ammunition has been brought to the position of the guns, but not all the shells made it through the barrel of the gun. A fair amount was sinking down in the mud in order to be gently pushed to the surface again that many years later. South of the farm, you will also, let me move this, south of the farm you will notice there's a cemetery there. Right there. That's a German cemetery which must have been established in 1914 or 1915. Because later on I'll show you an aerial picture taking of the area before the Battle of Passchendaele actually started up. And it already shows that cemetery. It was a fairly big cemetery, so it stayed there. And you might think, what do you mean with that? Well, let it be clear that by the end of the war there were hundreds of cemeteries dotted in Flanders fields. Far too many to maintain. On Varlet Farm alone there were 3 German cemeteries. 15 bodies together, 20 bodies together, that was a cemetery. In January 1919 the decision has been taken to round up the small cemeteries. And with small I mean less than 50 bodies. All those were going to be exhumed. And that took place on both sides. The Allies as well as the Germans. So then you have 2 options. Exhuming those bodies, well, either you bring several cemeteries together in a concentration cemetery, or you add them to an already existing cemetery. Tuinkot is a perfect example of a cemetery which has been extended. For those amongst you who have visited Tuinkot, well, initially it was a tiny little cemetery. It was King George V who came to the salient in 1922 who decided that that was going to be the spot of the largest cemetery. Because on that spot, you can see the spires of Ypres and you can see the spire of Passchendaele. It's a significant place for the Battle of Passchendaele. You overlook the whole salient from one spot. So in 1919 the decision was taken to round them up. The cleaning up operation actually took as long as September 21. And by that stage the Allies had 150 cemeteries in the salient. The Germans had 130 cemeteries, which balances out fairly well. The Allied cemeteries had been given a license which was valid for perpetuity. Perpetuity does mean eternity though in Belgium. It means 125 years. But don't you worry, I can assure you that the period of 125 years is going to be extended. The German cemeteries, however, the 130 they had in September 21, were given a license which was valid for 30 years. So if we add 30 years, September 21, September 1951, Hooray! We've just gone through the whole story again. And as a result of that, the Belgian authorities refused to renew all the licenses. Only 4 licenses have been renewed, forcing the German authorities to exhume 120 cemeteries, to concentrate them down to the 4. Well, Tyncott today is the largest Commonwealth War grave cemetery on the continent, with nearly 12,000 graves. The German cemetery, which is closest to Violet Farm, in the village of Langemark, and that's not the largest one, 44,000. To narrow it down, 130 to 4, there wasn't sufficient space. Hence the fact that the German cemeteries have mass graves. In Langemark, there's 25,000 buried together in one mass grave. So, on the next slide, this is an aerial shot taken before the Battle of Passchendaele started up. It comes from the Imperial War Museum, and it was sent to me by Lieutenant Colonel. He said, I've seen pictures taken at the end of the war, of the Battle of Passchendaele as well, but I thought that wasn't worthwhile sending to you, because there's nothing to be seen. And I thought, shame. It would have been worthwhile sending to me, because it would have shown in 3 months' time to what extent the area had been destroyed. Again, you can see in the red rectangle, the original side of Violet Farm, which was moved slightly to the west, closer to the road where the buildings are today. In the top right-hand side corner, you can see that zigzag line, which was a German battalion trench, connected with the communication trench with the original farmhouse. Violet Farm is indicated on trench maps with a C, and the C stands for concrete, because the buildings had been reinforced with concrete from the inside. And why from the inside? Well, to avoid that enemy airplanes coming over on a reconnaissance tour would recognize it as a strong point. Seen from the air, it was just another ordinary farm. In reality, Violet Farm was an advanced German strong point. Sure enough, the feature of being surrounded by water was an extra help in the defense. The name Violet Farm was given by soldiers. And why did they name it Violet Farm? Well, there I have to be honest in saying, I don't know. But I can tell you that when you look at trench maps, you will often notice that in the same sector of the battlefield, farms are being given names starting with the same letter. So to the east of us, there's Faber Farm, Vanity Farm, Veal Farm, Vox Farm, Pat Cottages. To the north of us, Bray Farm, Banff House, Burke's House. South, we are looking at Wall Farm, Winchester, Waterloo, Waterfields. But the logic wasn't always there. Our closest neighbour to the west, Inch Houses. There's not a single other farm with an eye in the whole neighbourhood. So the British logic, one can discuss that one. So on that picture there too, you see that cemetery, which was still there at the time. It's no longer there. It has been exhumed in the 1950s. It's completely gone now. There are some trenches to be seen, but of course from a distance you might not spot them, but in the bottom left corner there's a trench. There was actually a trench entering the present farmyard. As we converted one of the old buildings into accommodation, which was in 1998, we had to dig new electricity cables in. And doing so, all of a sudden my husband came across black burnt earth. Examining that, we came across bullets. German bullets, French bullets, British bullets. Clear enough it was a spot where ammunition had been dumped after the war. Collected and set to fire. The carbide burned and left nothing but burnt soil. We found bullets which were complete, we found cartridges, but nothing really dangerous anymore. Let that be clear. The dangerous stuff comes later. This is a situation such as it looks today. An aerial shot of Violet Farm today. To the north of I would say the top of the picture, you can see 2 water ponds, which are remains of the original moat. The rest has all been filled in. So the original buildings were actually in the circle of water. The right-hand side pond, there's an oak tree, which goes back to 1922. Well, to 1920, sorry. I should correct myself. My husband's family moved into the area in 1920. I told you that the original inhabitants of Violet Farm ran off to France, and they never came back. Belgian civilians came back to the villages, and they came back to the towns, but they didn't come back to the countryside. Because in towns and villages people owned their houses. And sure enough, they were keen on building their lives up again, starting from scratch again. The situation on the countryside was slightly different though. Going back to medieval times, farms were in the hands of noble families. And that was no different for Violet Farm. In the hands of a noble family living in Brussels. So farmers were tenant farmers. And then to come back to an area which was completely destroyed, to start from scratch, most of them decided not to do so. We are renowned to come back, to be tied to the place where we were born, so you would expect everyone to come back in the spring of 1920. Well, it's proven with statistics that until 1927 there was a constant stream of immigration towards France. Some of the Belgians who had run to the last part of Belgium which had never been occupied were quick enough to come back to the salient and to discover the devastation. And they couldn't cope with it. Friends, family, neighbours had moved on to France and they stayed in touch with letters with one another. And as a matter of fact, the friend said, well, why don't you come to France? After all, life isn't all that bad here. So the majority of Belgian people, the ones who did come back in an early stage on the countryside, they moved on to France and decided to stay there. I would say if ever you go to Normandy, to Brittany, pick up any given phone book and I can assure you, you will stumble across Dutch-sounding names, and that's a direct result of the Great War. So there we are in 1920. Civilians start to return, but not on the countryside. How can you convince the population to settle somewhere? It's still the same old rule. Promise them money, and that works. The Albert Fund has been raised in 1920. Money in that fund was coming from Germany, reparation money. And it was promised to whoever was willing to pick up the challenge to level the fields to make the area livable again. Well, my husband's great-grandmother must have been, let's say, a strong-willed lady. Because she took the opportunity with both hands. They lived in Maldegem, about 40 kilometers to the northeast, on a small property as tenant farmers. They took the opportunity to move to a farm twice the size. Okay, they were going to be tenant farmers again, but at least on a farm twice the size. The first 5 years, no rent to be paid. And on top of that, per hectare you were able to level, you were going to be financially compensated. Come on, must have sounded like music. Well, if it was music, it surely wasn't a nice tune. Because as they arrived, there was nothing there. An auntie of my mother-in-law passed away 2 years ago. She was 16 years of age as they arrived in the area. And she told me, we came to an area which was a desolate landscape. It was like the moon. There was nothing. Our father had to look for wooden boards. Our father had to look for corrugated iron. And they put together some barrack, some type of barrack. So can you imagine a family with 5 young children leaving everything behind, moving to an area, starting from scratch? One big mistake, I dare say, has been made by the British forces in the Battle of Passchendaele. And that was the opening bombardment. From July 16 till July 30th, a fortnight before the Battle of Passchendaele started up, all available guns had been lined up on the outskirts of Ypres and had been shelling this area. And I'm talking of a strip of land of about 15 kilometers long, at the maximum 8 kilometers deep. Do I have to make a drawing to explain what it does to the soil? 4.2 million shells. Every square meter of earth had been turned up time after time. But worse than that, not only the structure of the soil had been destroyed, but the drainage system. The drainage system which is so essential there, that was completely gone as well. You may have been reading about the Passchendaele Ridge. Well, don't expect to see mountains. The ridge is 55 meters above sea level. Violet Farm is 25 meters above sea level, which means that the water table in summertime, a dry summer, is sitting about that deep below the surface. In wintertime, that is where the water table sits, right on top of the surface. So drainage was essential. The topsoil is lime ground. Below the lime we have clay. Oh yes, it does rain a fair amount in Belgium, but it usually rains from October on, throughout winter time. Our summers are normally seen not that wet, except for 1917. The summer of 1917 is still in the top 10 of wettest summers ever recorded. So there we are, shelling the structure of the soil to pieces, destroying the drainage system. And didn't it start raining on July 31st? The opening day of the Battle of Passchendaele, it rained. And it rained. And it kept on raining. Well, the combination of those three things together is telling the Battle of Passchendaele in one word, and it's a very short one in English. It's mud. Canadian soldiers who have been involved towards the end of the Battle of Passchendaele, all of them who have been there could testify. The mud was beyond description. You couldn't understand. And even for us as farmers today, I can assure you, we've been working on the fields in much wetter conditions than it was ever the case in 1917. And yet we didn't drown. No, of course not. The drainage is working. So farmers settling back in the area, putting one clay pipe at a time. Time consuming, expensive. It took ages to level the fields. But the ones who were sticking it out managed to survive in the salient. Now the pond which I referred to, when my husband's grandmother arrived in the area, together with her parents, she said the only leaf of green to be seen for miles around was a little twig growing next to the pond. Today it's a magnificent oak tree. So we've been able to trace down the history of Violet Farm as far as 1745. It stayed in the hands of the same noble family throughout centuries. It stayed in their hands throughout the First World War. Now the money was being given to the owners of the farm. But of course it was in their interest that the property was being built up again, and they passed it on to the farmers involved, asking for their advice, because what did noble families know about modern farm buildings of the 1920s? My husband's family arrived in 1920, but the first buildings were only established in 1922. If ever you visit the salient, well, between Ypres and Passchendaele, I can guarantee you there's not a single building any older than 1922. Please don't be fooled by the buildings in the centre of Ypres. They look medieval, but I tell you, they're not. If you want a real thing, go to Bruges. If you want a fake one, go to Ypres. It's all been rebuilt. The cloth hall, it took as long as the 1960s to finish it, and yet it looks very old, but it's not. During the Second World War, my mother-in-law was living on the farm. It was occupied territory. They've been lucky to a certain extent, because the German army, well, didn't they return? By the time they approached Passchendaele, the father of my father-in-law, having been to the First World War, he said, oh, well, here we go again. Loading the stuff on the trailer, and off they went, on the run. They were 3 kilometers down the road as the news got to them that the Belgian king had surrendered. They were back home in the evening. My mother-in-law has often said, as long as he didn't get involved with the resistance, you had nothing to fear. And actually, living on a farm was one of the best places to be, because there was a basic level of food production. At least they didn't suffer from hunger. That's a fact. So how is the First World War affecting us today, that many years later? Well, by what the soil is giving up to the surface again. Human remains. Human remains, I have to be honest in saying, it's unlikely for farmers to come across human remains. And the reason being, we are ploughing about that deep. Sure enough, there are human remains still in our fields. There's no doubt about it. But when you plough that deep, well, you can't see it. And when the plough is hitting skeletons, I'm sorry, it may sound indecent, but the bones will fall apart, you would never know as a farmer. Already you've picked up that 30 soldiers are still being discovered in the salient per year, but then not by farmers, by contractors, putting in electricity cables, drainage systems, digging ditches, digging anything up. When working with a big crane, taking a whole lot of earth, tipping it out, oh, bones, oh, we need to have a closer look there. And that is how human remains are being found. About 2 kilometers to the east of our farm, just below, I would say, Passchendaele New British Cemetery, in the late 1990s, a farmhouse has been knocked down in order to build a big new villa. So digging foundations, human remains were being found. Immediately it became clear that those human remains were Canadians. There was a regimental badge. Going to some research, it came to the surface that 56 soldiers had been reported missing in action. So technically seen, those 3 came of the group of 56 missing soldiers. Canadian authorities gave the order for DNA research to be done on those skeletons. The idea was to build up the DNA profile of these 3 soldiers, and the next stage would have been to take DNA samples of the relatives of those missing men. If they were going to have a match, at least they were going to be able to put a name to the skeletons. But you hear me saying if. And the reason why? Well, it didn't work. During the official reburial of these soldiers, I had a chat with the professor who carried out the research. And he explained to me that when doing research on DNA, they're doing it in 16 different levels. They start with the knowledge that everyone is related to everyone. So every step up they go, they narrow down the pyramid, till eventually they come on top of the pyramid, the one and unique human being which we all are. He said if we manage to work up to 9 levels, and if we then have a match with another sample, we take it for granted that it's not a coincidental match. However, with the samples of Passchendaele, they only managed to work up to 6 levels, which didn't even justify to take samples of the relatives, because they were bound to have several matches. So what is determining the outcome? Acid soil, wet soil, dry soil, fertilizers being used, working with hair, teeth, bone, skin. It all has an effect on the outcome. So it didn't work with the Canadian soldiers. They have been reburied with full military honour as partly identified 3rd Canadian Infantry Battalion. Would say if ever you visit the salient Passchendaele New British Cemetery, towards the bottom end of the cemetery, overlooking that wall, the bottom picture shows them at the left-hand side corner where you see the trees. Well, that is where the remains have been found. No. The procedure is when the remains are being found, whether it's by a contractor or whoever, that you have to call the police. And immediately the police comes out to check whether or not it's a victim of a recent murder. In most cases, it's easily identified as a soldier. A button, part of equipment, a sign, an insignia gives away that it's a soldier. The procedure is then to hand over the remains to an officer of the Belgian Army, whose duty it is to contact the Commonwealth Workers' Commission, the Deutsche Volksgraberbund, the French equivalent. The Belgians, they're not Belgians being found there, I must admit. The Belgians were involved further north. I have to say immediately that it's only the Commonwealth Workers' Commission who goes to the effort and the trouble to try to identify soldiers. The Germans don't want to know, the French don't want to know. That is a fact. Several times a year, soldiers are being reburied. The Germans do it quick and quietly. The Commonwealth Workers' Commission always does it with the respect needed. You can see how different countries deal with their past. You can even see it that many years later, the way they deal with human remains being found. Other than human remains, we are finding ammunition as well. German ammunition, French ammunition and British ammunition. These shells, I don't know whether there are some artillery people in the room here. Those are the most commonly used during the Great War. And those are the ones we find by the dozen. Well, to a lesser extent, the French ones. The ones at the left-hand side are the German 77 mil, in the middle the French 75 mil, and to the right-hand side, the British 18-pounders. How can you identify them easily if you have no knowledge? Well, it's very simple. Looking at the driving band. A driving band low to the base of the shell immediately gives away you're dealing with German ammunition. A driving band higher up from the base, that's French. And low to the base, that's British. And then you might ask, what about Belgian ammunition? Well, I can't tell. We don't find Belgian ammunition where we are, because the Belgians were defending the line further to the north, from Boezingen to the coast. That's where they were fighting. And the only time the Belgians were involved in the salient, the 28th of September 1918, during the Liberation Offensive, well, by then the Belgians were using the French ammunition. So there's nothing Belgian to be found. German 77, French 75. So there's 2 millimeters difference between one and the other. Let it be clear that that is not a coincidence. It was a very clever move to have a gun which was that tiny little bit bigger than the enemy, because it allowed the Germans to recycle French ammunition. Whenever they could get hold of French ammunition, you can use a 75 in a 77 gun. It won't be 100% accurate, but it works. The opposite, you can forget about that. No. 18-pounders, well, I can't tell you, not to 100 precise, not to a 500 precise, how many we've brought home over the years. Our farm has 40 acres. Belgium is a small country, farms are small. Every year again, that many years later, we are ploughing to the surface between 20 and 30 live shells. The empty ones we don't count, they're just being thrown on a heap. Let it be clear that not all live shells have been launched on Violet Farm fields. Our neighbours are finding just as many. Until 2009, the Belgian Bomb Disposal was collecting a number of live ammunition which easily floated over 200 tons a year. 2009, for the first time, it dropped below that limit. 196 to be precise. 2010, it dropped to 174. And the numbers for 2011 have just been released, 140. So that is a substantial drop. But still, if you think of it, that many years later, I'm not talking of pieces, I'm talking of tons, it's an incredible amount still coming to the surface. Some calculations have been made. How many more years will live ammunition come to the surface? And some people say 70 years and others say 700. Fact is, I won't live long enough to see the last one coming to the surface. When my husband is ploughing, when farmers are ploughing in the area, it's quite common to hear the plough hitting artifacts. You don't know whether you're hitting a live shell, a cartridge, a fuse, a part of a shell, you don't know. And it's not as such that farmers are going to pull over to find out, because if they would be doing so, they would never finish ploughing at the end of the day. So when you hit a shell, whether it's live or empty, doesn't matter, it's going to be pushed over gently. And you know there's a pressure in the soil which gently pushes everything to the surface. So the year after, it's going to be pushed a bit higher. And again the year after, it comes a bit higher. Well, sooner or later will come a day that the plough will cut underneath, turning the whole lot to the surface. So why would you dig for it? It's just a matter of being patient. The only times we actually start digging is when the tractor is being stopped by something big. And something big, well, on one of our fields we have a lump of pillbox which has been exploded, but there's a big lump of concrete still below the surface. Every year again the plough hooks onto that and is being damaged. But it's too big to bring to the surface, so it's a matter of fixing the plough and keep on going. A roll of barbed wire, that's big enough to stop you as well. But generally spoken, whatever you hit moves gently over, and sooner or later it will come to the surface. We are finding shells of 3 different countries, but we are finding shells in 3 different conditions. The one standing up to the left-hand side is a used shell. And you might wonder, well, it's still complete. Oh yes, it's a shrapnel shell. Those, even after having been fired, still remain complete. The one laying to the left-hand side is a shell which has been fired, but it's a dud one. The driving band is clearly carved in. You see, it's carved in, which means it has gone through the barrel of a gun, because the rifling carves in on the driving band and gives that spinning move to the shell. So whenever you spot a shell with a carved-in driving band, you know it has been fired. Doesn't mean it exploded. This one didn't. And we do find a fair amount of shells which have been fired but didn't go off. How can you tell the difference between one and another in case the fuse has gone? Well, the weight gives that away. That's why I always warn tourists to the salient, please do not pick up any shell of which the driving band is carved and the fuse is gone. Because people automatically jump into conclusions that it's filled in with earth. And of course, as a tourist, if you only pick up the one, how would you know? In our case, we can tell immediately by the weight, watch out, The one at the right-hand side is a British 18-pounder, which has never been used. It's unused, the driving band hasn't been carved in, the fuse is still there. Our farm stayed behind the German lines from October 20th, 1914 till October 26th, 1917, so full 3 years. It has then been captured, and the 26th of October is a date with significance for your army as well. Because that's the first day that the Canadians got involved in the Battle of Passchendaele, the first attack. As a matter of fact, the Canadians went over the top on our fields, just south of the farm. The farm itself was captured by the Royal Naval Division, covering the left flank of the Canadian forces. And although they pushed the lines forward 500 metres, I can assure you that the British artillery has never been as far that farm. And yet I have an unused 18-pounder. But that's a different story. Last year I welcomed a group of Canadian youngsters visiting the battlefields, visiting the whole Western Front, the Somme, Vimy Ridge, the salient. They were booked in for a lunch stop at my place and then a guided tour. And while they were having their lunch, I had a chat with the teacher, the driver and the guide of that bus and coach, and I said to them, well, in a couple of minutes' time you'll be surprised to see the huge amount of live ammunition which is still coming to the surface. Immediately the teacher turned to me and he said, live ammunition? You must be joking. And I said, no, I'm not. You'll see. And then he looked me in the eye and he said, and how would you know? And I thought, okay, I'll get back to that one. So I took the group outside and I started talking about the ammunition which is laying outside. I don't bring that inside, I take the group outside. And I started providing information, and the same teacher stepped forward and he said, Charlotte, now that I realise there is live ammunition to be found, I remember that I saw some of our youngsters picking something up nearby Vimy. Do I need to say more? A British unused 18-pounder and a 13-pounder in the boot of a coach on Flanders cobblestone roads on its way to Varlet Farm. Well, I told that teacher, how could you? You are supposed to be responsible for these youngsters. I can tell you one thing, that man took a lesson of a lifetime. Never say to a woman, how would you know? So we are finding ammunition of different types as well. The traditional ammunition, canisters, shrapnel, high explosive. Canister is the left-hand side one. Well, I've added that to be complete, but I must say immediately that canisters are not being found in the salient. I've got very close contacts with the bomb disposal, and they've confirmed they've never ever found the canister. Canister is completely made in brass, explodes as it leaves the barrel of the gun, filled in with shrapnel. The middle one though, the shrapnel shells, well, we find those by the dozen. High explosive shells are commonly found as well. And then we have another range of shells, gas shells. Gas shells were initially, I would say, almost innocent. Fire, smoke, white phosphorus was the combination. We go to smoke and fire at the same time, but then it becomes more serious. Vomiting gas, you can say, well, what's the danger of that? On its own, there's no danger involved. But it becomes really mean when you use it in combination with something else. In July 1917, for the first time, the Germans used Blowkreuz, powdering Blowkreuz shells on the British positions, and soldiers turned sick. They were throwing up, and the next shell that landed was one with mustard gas. And that's when the damage occurred, you know. The toxic shells, well, let it be clear, there has been an evolution in toxic shells. It all started up very basic with chlorine gas. Germany as a country was familiar with the use of chlorine in their textile industries. And accidents which had occurred in the industries and the factories had made clear what the effect of chlorine was on human beings. Burning the eyes, burning the windpipe. Hence the fact that the German army started to think, well, why can't we use that as a weapon? The first gas attacks, very basic. Chlorine being pumped into big canisters and canisters being dug in their trenches. And the first gas attack was actually set to take place southeast of Ypres, across the Menin Road. You have already heard of Hellfire Corner. Well, Hellfire Corner is on the Menin Road. Soldiers being brought up from their billets in Popperingen to Ypres were marching through Hellfire Corner, from where on they were distributed to the northern sector or the southern sector of the front line. So the German enemy knew only too well, if they could hit the enemy on the Menin Road, well, they were going to hit him badly. Hence the fact that they planned the first gas attack there. There was one minor problem though, well, depending on which side you look at it. The Germans were fighting from east to west, so they needed south wind from the south or southeastern wind. The prevailing winds in our country are bringing the beautiful weather from the UK. In other words, north-northwest. They couldn't release the gas. It was going to be blown to their own positions. The gas canisters were being moved to the north. April 22nd. It's a day which I'm sure you all know. The wind was blowing from the north, the gas was being released, and chlorine gas, being heavier than air, was floating above the soil, dropping down into the enemy trenches. It were French colonial soldiers and Belgian soldiers defending the line at the time. They ran away, and you can't blame them. They had no protection whatsoever. It were Canadian soldiers who saved the day. They had just arrived in the salient, and they were thrown into the battle with as only order, put a stop to the German advance. And that's what they did. The cost of life has been huge, has been tremendous. But they succeeded in their task. The Germans, hoping for a final breakthrough, well, it didn't occur. The Canadians prevented that. From chlorine gas, they went on to phosgene gas, because two lessons were learned. You can't win the war when depending on the wind. That's not your companion in warfare. So that's a problem which we have to overcome. Well, easily done. Let's pump the gas into the 77 Mills shells, because that gun is readily available all over the Western Front. And that allows us to launch the gas wherever we want it to be. Problem number 2 is that chlorine gas only remains active 5 minutes, 8 minutes at the very most. So really you need huge amounts to keep control over the enemy. So we need to develop a type of gas which is efficient for a longer time. And the answer to that was phosgene. Phosgene remains active up to 8 hours. When you inhale it, it results in the fact that lung sacs are bursting, lungs are filling in with blood, soldiers start coughing up blood, and once they're doing that, you know they're lost. There's nothing that can be done to save them. One step further, the jewel on the crown, I would say, from German point of view at least, mustard gas. Used for the very first time in July 1917. And mustard gas is a very mean weapon. It's a fluid which the shell explodes in the air, it evaporates in tiny little drops, contaminating a whole area, remaining active up to 8 days. A tour of duty was 5 days. Soldiers being sent in the front line, relieving soldiers who had been there for the 5 days, because that was the longest that the human nervous system could sustain. Any longer and they would all go down with shell shock, Well, they were surrounded by an area which was contaminated with gas. They couldn't see it, they couldn't smell it, and yet it was there. It's breaking down the morale. But on top of that, when mustard gas came down, getting in touch with the uniforms, it was penetrating through the uniforms. It was penetrating through the skin, creating huge blisters. Still today, the Belgian bomb disposal is warning Belgian farmers never to touch a shell without gloves. Well, I have to admit we don't listen too well. We Belgians, we only take it for granted, once we've experienced it ourselves. And why do they say so? Well, because they refer to the fact that shells may be sweating, and it's got nothing to do with sunny temperatures. It means that little parts of mustard gas have penetrated through the iron shield of the shell. And again, you wouldn't see it, and you wouldn't smell it. But it's sitting there. The moment it gets in touch with the skin, even that many years later, it still creates blisters. Soldiers who were in a cloud of mustard gas inhaling that gas, it resulted in the fact that their lungs were shrinking and they were suffocating. Towards the end of the war, I'm talking of September 1918, arsenic gas made its appearance. Arsenic gas, when you inhale it, results in the fact that white blood cells are dying off. So little by little, the body is poisoning itself. There are numbers released saying that less than 1% of all soldiers who died can be blamed on gas. Well, I disagree on that. Soldiers who were wounded, but victims of gas as well, would always be listed as died of wounds, because that's what they could see. Soldiers who were dying in the 1920s, coughing their lungs out, wouldn't appear in the numbers. So it's definitely a higher percentage. A number of years back, I was guiding a colonel from Saskatchewan in a museum in Passchendaele. And I soon found out that his knowledge was I would say almost bigger than mine on the area. He had been coming to the sailing for 40 years. There was nothing much more I was going to teach him. He told me that until the 1960s, he was visiting First World War veterans in hospitals with lungs which were completely destroyed, attached to oxygen. They couldn't leave the hospital. That is a forgotten group of victims. In the 1960s, whoever thinks of them, they spent their entire life in a hospital. Victims of the First World War. Unknown, anonymous victims. So traditional ammunition, the shrapnel one, is by far the one we find the most. Shrapnel shells have been designed to kill and wound as many soldiers as possible. So shrapnel shells are being used in two different ways. Either high up, coming down close by, projecting their deadly hail of little end shrapnel balls on top of the enemy soldiers in the opposite trench, or they were being used against advancing infantry. And in that case they would be fired rather flat, spreading the hail towards the soldiers. I would say a shotgun, but on a bigger scale. So in order to achieve that, and I mean an explosion in the air, they needed time-setting fuses. High technology that was for those days. Time-setting fuses have been invented and designed by German engineers before the Great War. They took a patent on it in London to protect their invention, centre of the world. Well, the Allies have been kind enough to copy that principle. And after the Great War, it was calculated out how many time fuses the Allies had been producing, and per fuse they had to compensate Germany. The lesson is, you don't break a patent. The principle is that the top of the fuse is filled in with gas, the two rings below are filled in with black powder. And that is one of the reasons why so many shrapnel shells didn't explode, because the black powder got too moisturous and didn't work anymore. The lowest ring has numbers on it, which are seconds in reality. So it was according to the distance and the angle they were firing at that they had to set the timing. 22 seconds at most. Of course, you don't want the clockwork to start ticking time away the moment you prepare the shell to be fired. So there's a very ingenious security system built in, which only allows time to start ticking away once the shell has left the barrel of the gun. And then the gas would penetrate through the fuse, through the tube which you see at the left hand side, and that fits at the inside of the shell. So the fuse would burn its way down, setting on the black powder which is at the base of that shell. And the black powder would develop the power to launch the contents out of the shell. So whenever you have an exploded shrapnel shell, you find a fuse, a tube and a shell case which is still complete. An 18-pounder contains about 270 up to 300 shrapnel balls. So imagine being under that, A 4.5-inch shrapnel shell, 900 shrapnel balls, coming at high velocity at you. How big are the chances? Other than that, there's the high explosive shells, where shrapnel was used to wound and kill soldiers. Also in an attempt to cut barbed wire, which of course it didn't do. That was wishful thinking. But high explosive shells were used to destroy pillboxes, tanks, buildings, trenches. Those had to go off on impact. And here again I go back to the mud of Passchendaele. You launch shells with a percussion fuse on mud, well, you know straight away it's not going to work. They disappear in the mud. We still dig up huge amounts of high explosive shells which have been fired, which didn't go off. That was the result of the mud. So, First World War high explosive shells, in most cases, they were supposed to burst open to create a shockwave in all directions. But in most cases they did as on the left-hand side picture, they just bursted open and the shockwave went one way. The middle one is a high explosive shell which we found. It has been fired and it's empty. And I can assure you, I didn't empty it. That's the way we found it. Coming back to that emptying, you might think, who might be foolish enough to do that? Well, I'm sorry to say there are Belgians who are stupid enough to do it. You might wonder, do accidents occur while farmers are ploughing? Yes, they do occur. But only one Belgian farmer was killed while ploughing his fields, since my knowledge goes back to 1970. Perhaps more before that, but from 1970 onwards till today, one Belgian farmer lost his life while ploughing. He had the bad luck of hitting a high explosive shell, which went off on the spot, Part of it was blown through the front, hit him in the back of his head, and he died of his neck, and he died on the tractor. But I must add immediately that on average, one Belgian civilian is being killed as a result of First World War ordnance. But then you can't really describe it as an accident. It happens to those who think they're wise and bright and clever enough to dismantle shells. Our neighbour's son blew himself in 1979, working on a British 18-pounder shrapnel shell, believe it or not, with a grinder. Not a good idea. He can't confirm that anymore, he's no longer around. If we put out shrapnel shells outside the gate, as we used to do when our children were toddlers, I can assure you that in the length of one night, they moved. They were gone. There are that many collectors still around in the salient. Years ago, if you would have come to the salient 20 years ago, it was quite common to see live ammunition nicely piled up in the electricity standards. They have openings while a farmer ploughing coming across a live shell, the easiest way to get rid of it, put it in an electricity standard, and the bomb disposal will spot it and will remove it. Unfortunately, too many private collectors started being faster than the bomb disposal. So it became forbidden to leave live ammunition within sight of people passing by. The law tells us that each and every time we come across live ammunition, whether it's a hand grenade or a live shell, we should call the bomb disposal. Well, that's a law which is being interpreted by Belgian farmers in the Belgian way. In other words, we don't do it. If we would call them per shell, per hand grenade, 140 tons, one piece at a time? Come on, it's a small unit. There wouldn't be sufficient hours in a day to collect everything. Farmers are making small collections which are then being reported twice, 3 times a year. The only difference with the old days is that it's now being kept out of sight of civilians passing by. But it's still being collected in small piles till eventually the bomb disposal comes round and takes a whole lot. At the right hand side I took a picture of a cartridge containing cordite, which we mainly find in sticks. But your time we find it in pellets as well. It did exist in powder too, but sticks is most commonly. During the Great War it happened that soldiers were eating cordite. Not that they were so particularly fond of the taste of it, but when you eat cordite, the heartbeat goes up, the temperature goes up, and the skin turns out to be grey. They reported themselves ill, hoping to get a ticket back home. Well, sadly enough for those soldiers, it didn't last all that long until doctors recognized the symptoms of someone who had been eating cordite. And if they were lucky, they were sent to the front line. If they weren't lucky, they were sent to court-martial. Some soldiers have been executed for trying to get away from their duty by eating cordite. All I can say on that is, more than words can possibly explain, it tells us how desperate those young men must have been. And after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years of warfare, I think we can all understand that one. How is ammunition being dealt with? Well, we are supposed to call the police, and the police calls the bomb disposal. That keeps everyone into a job. So they're driving around with a little van like that. If ever you visit the salient and you see one of those, don't get too close, please. So at the right hand side you can see how it was in the old days, putting it in the electricity standards. There's a 77 mil standing against the electricity standard, and I can tell from a distance it's a German shell. How come? Well, it has a zinc fuse. Something which is often overlooked in the Great War is the blockade which was put on the German harbours by the British Navy, stopping them from importing material. And yes, it's commonly known that the Germans were good enough in putting their hands on anything they could in the countries they were occupying. Church bells, cooking pots, anything which was metal was being shipped to Germany to keep the war industry going. But there came a stage that even that source was drying up, and by 1917 we had reached that stage. So the Germans had to start looking for alternative. Zinc fuses or an alternative. Rubbish quality, but it was either that or nothing, so we go for that. Iron cartridges were used by the German army. Well, iron does not expand nor shrink as brass does. So the big disadvantage of iron cartridges is that sometimes it was blowing their own guns. Again, it shows how desperate the German army was for material to keep the war production going. So soldiers collect the ammunition like that, and then it goes to the bomb disposal, situated 6 kilometers to the north of the place where I live today. One brave Belgian soldier is being given a hammer, and he's supposed to hammer off the mud, and then they can identify it. From there on, it goes into the computer system, which means today, at the end of the year, the bomb disposal can push the button and then can tell you exactly how many 18-pounders, how many 10.5 shell, 105 millimeters, they found over the years, in the length of the year. They can give you the exact details on each and every shell. So once identified, the shells will then be dug in those boxes. And they will be dug in 5 meters down into the soil. Twice a day, 5 days a week, 7 months a year. A Belgian landmine is nicely put on top of it, and the next thing is bang. Twice a day, 11:30 in the morning, 3:45 in the afternoon. You can set your watch to it, That's an easy way to deal with traditional ammunition. So that's the outcome, the big bang. Thunder in the distance it is for us. You can hear it nicely. And sometimes we say, the bomb disposal had a busy day today. It keeps on going, So that's easy enough with traditional ammunition. There's another problem. The gas ammunition. How do we deal with those? You can't set gas shells to explode. Until 1970, it was allowed to pour gas shells into big blocks of concrete, and those would then be dumped into the sea. Well, Belgium has a very short coastal line, only 67 kilometers. We've been kind enough to dump it in front of France. The Belgian Navy has been very active there. The reason why is in the Gulf of Biscay, the sea quickly drops down. So it was assumed that it was safe there. It was going to rest on the bottom of the sea. It wasn't going to disturb anyone ever. Until 1970. Then awareness started to come to the surface about the environment. So what is the effect of the salty water going to be like on those concrete blocks? The question mark today is, will the gas ever be released into the sea? Well, we all hope not, but no one can guarantee. The result of that was that from 1970 onwards, it became forbidden to dump into the sea. So gas shells have been piled up on the bomb disposal base just in my back garden, by all means. By 1998, I had a stockpile of 27,000 toxic shells, not knowing really well how to deal with those. Well, I can assure you that the Belgian locals there, the civilians there, started to get a bit worried. What if a plane would drop? What if the earth would tremble that little bit too much? Okay, I know it's unlikely to happen, but to think in modern times. Terrorist attacks? That's a good objective. So it's under pressure of the local Belgian population that eventually a dismantling factory has been built, 1998. It started working the year after, and at that stage the Belgian bomb disposal still had the hopes and the strong belief that they were going to be able to dismantle all toxic ammunition in some 5 to 10 years' time. For many years it looked like they were never going to make that date. But I must admit, they made it. January 2007, the last toxic shell in the stockpile has been dealt with. Mind you, there's no risk for those guys to lose their job, because amongst a huge amount of live ammunition which is still being unearthed today, there's sufficient to keep them going, So, keep on going. I wanted to show the graph below. Well, the canisters I've explained. The Germans moved from high explosive to a mixture of high explosive and gas, because the soldiers after a certain length of time could tell by the sound that it was a high explosive shell. So nothing we can do against that, just keep our positions. And then the Germans started mixing that. The disadvantage of the middle type is that the high explosive canister was burning a certain amount of the gas trapped in the shell, so that wasn't really efficient. Hence the fact they moved to the right hand side type, where the high explosive was on the top, and then the gas was released after that. Now keep on going. Pictures showing the effect of different gas shells, smoke, smoke is clear enough. The middle picture is an interesting one though. That's an aerial shot showing chlorine gas being released. And you can see the clouds drifting towards the enemy. And you can, I don't know whether you see it from a distance, but there's soldiers waiting behind it, ready to go into the attack. The white phosphorus, well, smoke and fire in combination. So, gas shells. How does the Belgian bomb disposal identify gas shells? Well, I can assure you, when they come to the farm to collect it, they can't tell. During the Great War, there were crosses painted on shells. There were rings painted on shells, and it was the colour code that gave away what the continent was. Sadly enough, the paint they used at the time wasn't the best of quality, because we've never ever found a shell with still paint sticking to it. And yet, the very odd time, we can identify gas shells. Lifting, in most cases, the long 77 millimeters, that's the best shot. You lift one of those, and you lift it up, and you shake it gently. If you hear something sloshing around, and honestly, that's not a joke, bingo, it's gas. But it only works one way. Not hearing a sound doesn't guarantee anything. The gas may be crystallized. It may be filled to that extent that it can't slosh around. So really, the only way to identify a toxic shell today is to put it to an X-ray machine, which allows them to have a look on the inside. And that's what they see. This is one of the shells which has been sweating, as they say. You can notice that the gas level is much lower than the canister with the high explosive. That's unusual. Normally the gas shells were filled just below the canister. You can see there's a measure device there. Well, it's important for the bomb disposal to know how high the level of the gas is, because the next stage in the process is with a circle saw to cut below the canister and above the gas. You can see, that's the normal situation, the gas just below the canister, and the third one is showing a tricky one. You can see that the high explosive is actually buried in the gas. So where do we cut there? There it becomes a matter of millimeters. You don't want to hit a high explosive and you don't want to hit the gas. That's how the problems they are confronted with. The next slide will show you a blowkreuz shell. So blowkreuz with vomiting gas was always trapped in bottles. Those are very rare to be found, It's exceptional that the bomb disposal still find one of those, but you can see the X-ray at the right-hand side, it clearly shows the bottle there. So that's vomiting gas. Once the fuse has been cut off with a circle saw, soldiers will be sent in with a uniform like that. And that seals them off completely. They can only work for a maximum length of 30 minutes in that uniform. If longer, they risk to go into a heat shock. Soldiers working in the bomb disposal unit have to go through medical checkups on a very regular basis. Well, a colleague guide of mine who worked in the bomb disposal for a long time of his period of time, he has values in his blood which are far too high. It's now proven that his uniform wasn't really sealing him off and protecting him as well as it should have. But there's nothing much they can do about that on hindsight. The injuries of gas, well, I've already touched that. Chlorine